Good morning, YouTube. In today's video, we're going to be continuing the size series. So with my power building approach, I do like to think of things in what is good for strength and what is good for size. So with the size series, we are going to be covering size, bodybuilding, how to actually build muscle with the purposes of getting stronger, and how to use strength training to build the most amount of muscle. So in the previous installment, I did talk about how you should try to, like, your mentality trying to build muscle when it comes to being a power builder. But one thing I do think needs to have its own video is actually the best way to use isolation exercises. One thing I think is kind of the weakness of a lot of, let's say, strength sports style training is that they think that because it's so non-specific, it's not useful or has very little value because there's a lack of carryover. Now, this is kind of why I like the power builder mentality, because when you identify, let's say, as a power lifter and you're doing calf raises, you can never really make a valid argument of, well, it's going to do this, this, or that, and it's going to have great carryover. Generally speaking, it's probably not. And then even bicep curls. But as a power builder, it's just like, well, I'm a power builder. Like, I don't like, I want to get big and strong. So it's just like, like what? Now people might be stumped, and they might give you some like other arguments or counter arguments, such as, well, when do you compete in power building? But who really cares? Like, your goals are your goals. Get stronger, get bigger. Who cares what anyone else has to say? They train their way, you train your way. So, but the issue is, because, YouTube fitness and a lot of the other content in this space is either very bro sciencey and bodybuilder like, where like it's not that great information, and they think that you need so many different types of isolation exercises, or you need to like have your pinkies out, like whether you're drinking tea or some shit, when you do your isolation exercises to maximally contract the muscle and get better gains. That's bullshit. Just as much as it's bullshit to say you shouldn't do isolations. So where do we find that middle ground? And that is what I hope to answer here. So before we get started, please like, comment, subscribe. Any topic ideas that you want me to cover, please leave them in the comments below. I will add them to the list, and it might take me a while to get to them, but I will do it. Also, if you are interested in coaching, I do have a coaching service available on my website, so please just check that out, as well as other free workout programs and more will be added, and also merch and apparel. So this is one of the Stand Strength t-shirts with the logo. I'm touching the wrong part of the chest because cameras confuse me. And then, but yeah, so nice black on black logo, looks clean, looks nice. But anyway, let's get started. 3 minutes in, let's go. Oh shit, touching the wrong things. All right, so first, what is the purpose of isolation exercises and why do they benefit you? So one thing that we need to understand and kind of get out the way is that isolation exercises are going to be important regardless of your goal, at least in my opinion. Now, I'm not like the best power lifter in the world. I'm not like a full-on powerlifting coach, but when I do have more strength-focused clients, I will always include some form of isolations and varying dosages depending on their goal. But when it comes to strength, when it comes to powerlifting, isolations do a great job with injury prevention. So overuse injuries are going to be very common, and you can usually kind of develop these mostly because when you overuse something, you overdevelop something, and that by its very nature and definition means something else is underdeveloped and underprepared in the long run, and that is not a sustainable way for you to implement consistency over time and a lot of effort over time. So that's why injury prevention is super important. That's why I do like my strength focused athletes or clients to do a lot of bicep work because of how much pressing they usually do. So it just kind of counteracts that, helps to keep their elbows feeling good. Next thing is just longevity. So like I meant, like I just kind of like brushed over and mentioned, if you are unable to be consistent with the gym, you're not going to get a lot of results. Your consistency will always be limited by your effort, and if your effort, like if you have perfect effort, perfect programming, and perfect whatever, and not consistent with it, then your effort will be limited by your consistency. Now, how you actually manage these two things is your longevity. How resilient are your muscles? How 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 much do you care about your recovery? These are things that you do need to take into consideration. I am a firm believer in, and I heard this the first time from Matt Wenning, but it is kind of common sense, but it's not something that we actually think about day to day. The person who lifts the longest gets the strongest. So when it comes to you breaking your body down, you exposing yourself to really heavy weights, and implementing that risk factor into your life by trying to get stronger, You want to have other factors that are also building up alongside of it to increase your longevity so that you can lift for a long time. So isolations allow you to do that. The next thing would be quality of life. So there is a video I have planned called the myth of functional training, just because, when we think of functional training, we think of those guys who like do some like really weird, overly complicated biometric mixed with barbell mixed with like it's basically shitty CrossFit, like because their logic is, when are you ever going to do this out in the real world? And it might even be worse than that because, at least CrossFit does variations of actual gym lifts, but this functional training stuff just makes stuff up because it's like, oh my god, you're gonna bench like you throw a punch. You're going to do an ab exercise like you're like rotating to pick something up behind you. I don't know. Like there's a lot of charlatans out there in that space. But when I talk about improved quality of life, there is something I do think that should be addressed, and that is, if you are strong with a variety of different exercises and a variety of different ranges of motion with a variety of different rep ranges, you are going to be more useful. You are going to be able to, like, as a horrible example, you are going to be the guy people call to help them move. And then you are not going to get tired as fast. You are going to be able to lift things into the truck much easier. And like what would have been maybe a 5-hour ordeal is now just a 1 or 2 hour ordeal, just because you picked it up and put it somewhere else a lot faster than most other people could, because you don't get as tired and your muscles are a lot stronger. So improved quality of life there. But also when it comes to these other basic tasks, you just don't get hurt. It just doesn't really bother you because your training is a lot harder than anything else a life can throw at you, which physically at least. So improved quality of life there. The next thing I do want to kind of just brush over is just leverages. Reason why I want to talk about this is because, you can't change your limb length. You can't change these things that you're born with. But what do I mean by improved leverages? When you increase your muscle mass, you actually give yourself a bit more, like, let's say, cushion for the pushing. So let's say you're doing a bench press. What you'll find is that the bigger your bicep is, the more support you'll feel. And just because of how much more stable the weight is, given the fact that you have these big biceps that help like accommodate you, you're able to then press out. Now, well, how much does that carry over to actual powerlifting? Probably not that much, because they usually rely on technique to get that effect rather than, big biceps. But I mean, with power building, you kind of get that best of both worlds approach, where it's just like, okay, my bench is a bit easier because, my biceps are providing a nice padding, and then I also have big biceps. Like, what's wrong with that? But that's just something I want to kind of brush over, because while it is a factor, it's not really like to my full understanding, and I could even be a little bit wrong about that, but I do know that it does at least play a factor into the decision behind some isolation exercises. The next and final and most important thing is that isolation exercises will potentiate performance if you are a powerlifter. Let's say you were doing a warm-up. I remember watching a Dave Tate podcast, and he said that some of the things that he did in training eventually revealed themselves to be rules implemented by other coaches of his time. So, for example, I think I know John Meadows, rest in peace, mentioned this a lot, and that is, before he squats, he works hamstrings. So he does like a lot of hamstring curls. I think Matt Wenning even does something similar with his Wenning warm up, because it just makes his squat feel a lot easier. So you can use it as part of your warm up. But then let's look at the next thing. Let's say you were trying to improve your squat. Are you just going to squat all the time? Probably not. You would probably benefit a lot from doing leg presses, belt squats, pendulum squats, hack squats, Smith machine squats even, because you were just building that muscle to be as strong as possible. So many other exercises that it carries over to your squat, and there's no downside to that. So isolation exercises, movements that bias a certain muscle more than others, will only help you if your goal is strength. Now let's look at bodybuilding. When it comes to bodybuilding, the most important thing that should be kind of understood is the fact that isolation exercises are going to be a big part of your program, but they shouldn't be the only part of your program. I've met a couple people who, because they consider themselves more bodybuilder minded, that they do exclusively isolation movements, and I just cannot understand that for the life of me. But I can understand, the part that I can understand is this: they don't like the barbell movements because they hear things like, it's not that great at building muscle. You're spreading around a lot of the volume and tonnage to like multiple muscles at once, which I don't think is a downside, but they like to paint it as one. And some movements just like those are a lot of the critiques, right? But here's my counter argument. That is why isolation exercises exist, because there are definitely downsides and weaknesses of the compound movements, but that doesn't disqualify them as being the basis of your program. So when it comes to bodybuilding, to have maximal muscular development, you do need to use isolations. There's no getting around that. I would never argue against that, because the power lifts by themselves do not hit all muscles, and they do not train all muscles equally. Look at the squat, bench, and deadlift. The muscles that are going to be very much included in there, like some shoulder, like, but not the whole shoulder, like where's the rear delts, where's the side delts in that, your triceps and your pecs. And for some lifters it'll be more tricep dominant, for some it'll be more chest dominant. It'll just kind of depend. But that's kind of what's being built with the bench press. Now with the squat, quads, some amount of hamstrings and glutes, and like some of your adductors and abductors, like in the leg, which is, good. I do think that when it comes to the lower body, you can be a little bit more minimalistic with the power lifts, because you are going to do a hip hinge, which is going to build up the posterior chain, the low back, the spinal erectors, and then of course the glutes and hamstrings. But where's everything else? Where are the lats? Where are the traps? I know the traps are involved in the deadlift and they can provide you with a big yoke, but I feel like they can also benefit a lot from actual direct work. Where are the biceps? Where are the rear delts? Where are the calves? These are usually muscles that a lot of people want to develop and build up, and they just don't get built up by the power lifts. But you make a huge mistake if you just think to yourself, that means I shouldn't do the power lifts. You should bench, you should squat, and you should deadlift. Now, whether or not you do the competition forms really just kind of varies on your preferences and what it works for you. Like, for example, with some of my clients who just don't like the deadlift, I tell them, well, here's the benefit of why you need to include some type of hip hinging into your program. And then usually we'll replace it with something like a low block pull or a low rack pull. So that way it's like mid shin, it's not off the floor. So then their spine is a bit more neutral, it's a bit safer. And then also, like, with the decreased range of motion, you can also like overload it a bit. So then you're going to develop your yoke more. So these are things that you can do. And then let's say squats, like maybe you have some limiting factors with your shoulders. So what you do is you use a safety squat bar or like a machine. Who cares? There's no such thing as an exercise you need to do for hypertrophy, but if you can do an exercise and you can get good results from it, why leave it out? So that's why I really recommend that for bodybuilding. Do big, heavy, basic compound movements, but also include the isolation movements, because they are going to help maximize your recovery or maximize your muscle growth, and they are going to accommodate the weaknesses that big compound movements do have. All right, now power building. You get the best of both worlds in smaller dosages. Now, this is kind of the trade-off and the opportunity cost of pursuing both size and strength concurrently. It kind of exists on a spectrum. On a older video, I do have a graphic that I do want to show. I'll probably put it up. This is going to be the first episode where I actually like try to edit some things. So hopefully it worked and you can actually see a graphic in this corner. And when you are trying to pursue multiple goals at once, when you could produce results in two different fields at one time, there is a relationship that exists between the two, and where there's going to be a curve, and you're not going to be able to get the most out of one variable or the other. You're not going to be able to get the most strength, you're not going to be able to get the most size, but you can get an optimal and efficient amount of both. It's going to be less than both, but at least you get both rather than just one. And I think that is worth the slight detriment that you get as a result of pursuing things concurrently. Like, yes, you are getting suboptimal results, but you're getting results in two things rather than just one. It's kind of like the jack of all trades is a master of none, but is often better than a master of one. I do really like that mentality, just because who doesn't want to be big? Who doesn't want to be strong? So let's look about why novices need isolations. When it comes to novices will vary in their actual starting point. But regardless, they're going to be great learning tools, whether you are a true novice, meaning you have never done anything physical in your life. If you are a true novice, that defines you. You have no coordination, no kinesthetic awareness, you have no technical, like, your technical starting point is literally zero. You're a new character, and the game doesn't give you much starting points, right? Versus someone who you know, they've been active all their life, maybe played some sports, but they never actually went into full-on training for strength or size. They're still a novice, and that's then that is a completely different starting point than just someone from starting from zero. And the next part would be someone who got strong and got big, but didn't know how. They're still novices too, and they are to a less extent, and they're going to become an intermediate a lot faster, but they still fall within that range. So novices actually vary in their starting point, but regardless, isolation exercises are a great learning tool. So when it comes to the big, heavy compound movements, especially for novices, there is going to just be this huge time and technique investment that they need to make before they get really anything out of it. Their squats, their bench, their deadlift, because of how technical they are, just because of how much individualization that they need for their technique, they will not really be getting all that much out of it. And a lot of the strength that they get is more so a refinement of their technique, their competence, their confidence, their coordination, rather than actual size and strength gains. So that is a limiting factor of the barbell movements. So that's why I like in my base building videos, I like to use a wider variety of exercises. Use things like machines, use things like dumbbells, use things like calisthenics, because you just need to teach them how to move their bodies. And then, of course, when it comes to the compound movements, because so much of the effort, the tonnage, and the volume is being distributed across um, multiple muscles, it's worthwhile to note that you should actually feel muscles. But the thing is, when you use a compound movement, you don't really know what you're feeling. So that's why that's a limiting factor of compounds. And how do you get around that? You actually put isolation movements into the mix. What does it feel like when your back is flexed? So that way, like, well, let's say you're doing seated cable rows and you feel your low back flexing, and then when your coach or when you remind yourself, I should feel my low back flexed, you know what it feels like. Otherwise, you just are going to be like kind of lost and confused and not going to be really get the most out of that cue. Now, the next thing when it comes to novices and needing isolation exercises is that isolation exercises give you novices the opportunity to not only feel the muscle, but also to work hard. They can push closer to failure, and it's a lot safer. The lower technical rating of the movement allows you to get easier bouts of high effort. So because the technique is, not really a concern, you can just focus on working hard. You can just focus on effort. You can just focus on pushing, because you know for a fact you are very likely to not get injured. And I think that's a great benefit for isolation exercises, which is why I don't like how most novice programs don't include them. Like, so for example, starting strength, the logic is there, like, just get strong and you'll get big. And of course, every other variation that has kind of like come from that, they either follow that mindset to a T, or they just add a little bit other exercises, or they just add too much. It's always like this weird juggling between all those things, but honestly you need some amount of both, some amount of all of it. But it should be there. Novices should use isolations. I will never argue against that. The main thing is it should never replace actual work, because if you just rely on isolations, eventually you're going to find them to be they're going to eventually become the limiting factor if you don't also include it in a program with compound movements. So include compounds, but also understand when you're first starting, it's technique work. It's just like trying to get better at the lift, and then you do some isolation exercises like machines, dumbbells, calisthenics to really allow yourself to push hard. Now let's look at the intermediate and advanced lifter. So intermediate and advanced lifters, they are going to become more resilient. They're going to have improved recovery. They're going to be able to handle more just because they've been training more and their body has adapted to it. But there's a couple things that I have noticed that I personally really try to recommend. And even though your recovery and volume improves, some movements just will not be friendly for what you can do. So I know that there is the example of a jar, and let's say you put the rocks in, which are your big heavy movements, then you put some pebbles in there, which are like, let's say, your supplementary or accessory movements, and then you put some sand and then some water, and that allows you to fill it up. But let's say you go in reverse. You do water, sand, pebbles, and rocks. It's going to overflow, whereas in the other way, it all fits into the jar. The reason why I bring this is because that is what recovery and training is like. Now, when it comes to certain movements, the bench press has a high amount of fatigue. So this is kind of where the stimulus to fatigue ratio concept kind of comes into play. And the you might be able to have more chest volume, but if you try to get it from the bench press, you'll find that your joints will be more beat up than they could be. You'll find that your next session will actually suffer because like those areas are just too sore. But let's say if you just did like a machine chest press or a chest fly, you would have been fine. That is something that you need to kind of modulate, where it's in, let's say for example, you run into a wall, you run into a recovery issue, and you're thinking to yourself, I need to cut down on chest volume. It's like, no, you need to cut down on bench press volume. You can still work your chest, just work it through different means. And the same thing applies to any other muscle group. The next part is, as recovery improves, you will be able to handle higher frequency. But while we know that muscles recover fast, and the more advanced you get, the faster they recover, so 24 to 48 hours, 48 hours when you're first starting out, and eventually you get better and your recovery comes down to 24 hours. The nervous system itself will not. This is something that I personally have made the mistake of, and it's something that my coach has talked me through. So my coach is Faz Lifts. If you want to get the coach's coach and just bypass me completely, go ahead and get him. But when it comes to a lot of ways that most people implement, like let's say a full body training program, while they undulate the intensities so that way they do something hard each time, the nervous system actually can't sustain that. So when I trained myself, I relied mostly on upper lower programs, which kind of take care of this by itself, just because the amount of recovery time between the next upper session, there's usually like a 72-hour period there, and obviously you're going to be very much recovered at that point in time. So it makes sense for me to it just made sense for me to work hard each time I went to the gym. But the more frequently I train, and right now, because I am doing something more approximating a full body, you have to be a bit more careful with that. So you have to change the ways you hit the muscle, because while the muscle is recovered, you're not able to put in that neuromuscular or that nervous system work, because strength is a neural adaptation. Strength is a skill, but it's also a like how fast are the neurons able to fire and everything like that to actually allow you to lift the weight. It's a neural adaptation in addition to obviously a muscular one. And the nervous system might recover a lot slower. So that's why isolation exercises can be a great way to get more muscular volume while letting the nervous system also recover. Next is that isolation do provide targeted volume. So this is kind of like something that we kind of touched on earlier into the video, but because heavy compounds distribute the tonnage to multiple muscles unevenly, you will benefit from doing isolation movements, because let's say on your bench press, you get a lot of triceps, but your chest really doesn't get that much. So you should include a chest focused movement into your program. The next argument that I want to kind of represent to you is the argument between weighted chins and bicep curls for bicep development. We know that if you have a really strong weighted chin, you're not going to have small biceps. At the same time, if you have a really strong bicep curl, you're going to have nice, big, strong biceps. So which one is better? There was a comparison between Juji Mufu and Brian Alsru. Brian Alsru has not done a curl since high school, and he still has one of the biggest arms on anyone. Whereas Juji Mufu, obviously he's more of a bodybuilder and like a hybrid athlete kind of way of going about things, but he does advocate for bicep curls. Here is kind of where I see the truth in both sides. Obviously, you're going to get better results with both. Now, when it comes to, like, let's say the decision between the two, when you're doing weighted chins, your back is going to take a lot of that, and your biceps will grow as a result, but it's going to be limited by the fact that your back is taking so much of it that the amount of actual tension on the bicep might not be all that much, whereas if you just targeted the bicep, all of that tension, while it might be like, let's say, absolutely less, it is relatively more, because let's say 90% of it is going to the bicep, and then rather than 90% of it going to the back. Now that's just numbers being thrown out there, but that is kind of the mindset I do want you to be in when you are doing these exercises. It's very counterproductive for you to think, I'm going to build big biceps by doing a chin up grip lat pull down. Like, it's going to help, it's not going to harm you, but don't trick yourself into thinking that that's going to be the best way to building big biceps. You should include both at best, and if you did have to just choose one, then you have to kind of take the downsides of your decision. And finally, as you get stronger, variations will start to provide a much better stimulus to fatigue ratio. So this is kind of like the idea of carryover, but it's also because, let's say Leg press just does not beat you up nearly as much as squats, but you're able to push so much harder on leg press than you would be on squats. So, and the stronger you get on that movement, the more you're able to push on squats. So um, it's just a win-win scenario basically, but it's kind of something that you need to implement and be mindful of if you start to run into recovery issues with the squat, but you can still do more on your quads and you can still push a lot more there. Eventually you're going to get to a point where the main lift is just too heavy, it tires you out too much, puts too much strain on the body. But when you do these isolation exercises, you can load them up and you're still going to feel the muscle more fine. This is kind of why people can like leg press 1,000 pounds for reps but can't really squat all that much, just because there's more to like resistance training than just the weight, than just the resistance. There's other factors that need to be included and taken into consideration, and how these movements and how these isolation exercises should be used. So hopefully I didn't confuse you and didn't lose you, but that is how I recommend isolation to be used when, depending on if you are a novice or if you are intermediate or advanced. If there are anything else if there are any questions, please leave them in the comments below. Otherwise, please like, subscribe, and if you are interested in apparel or coaching, please visit my website. Other than that, thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.